Jake had always dreamed of speaking English fluently. He had spent countless hours memorizing grammar rules, practicing verb tenses, and writing down difficult words in his notebook. His phone was filled with English learning apps, and he even tried speaking in front of a mirror. But despite all his efforts, whenever he had to talk to someone in English, his mind would go blank. His words would get stuck, and he would struggle to form proper sentences. One evening, frustrated and exhausted, Jake decided to take a walk in the park to clear his mind. As he sat on a bench, lost in thought, he overheard a conversation between an elderly man and a foreign tourist. The old man spoke English so effortlessly, with confidence and ease, as if it were his first language. Jake was amazed. Curious, he approached the man after the conversation ended. "Sir, how did you learn to speak English so fluently?" Jake asked. The old man smiled knowingly. "I didn't learn it by studying too much grammar or memorizing words," he said. "I learned by listening. To speak well, first, you must listen well." Jake frowned. "Listening? But I always focus on speaking and practicing grammar." The old man chuckled. "That's where most learners go wrong. When you were a baby, did you start speaking first? Or did you listen to your parents for months before saying your first words?" Jake had never thought about it that way. Could it be that he was focusing on the wrong thing all along? That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the old man's words. Maybe listening was the missing piece in his journey to fluency. The struggle. After his conversation with the old man, Jake went home deep in thought. He had spent years studying English, learning grammar rules, memorizing long lists of vocabulary, and practicing sentence structures. But he realized something shocking. He had never truly listened to English. Sure, he had heard English words before, but he never focused on understanding how native speakers actually spoke. Determined to change his approach, Jake decided to test the old man's advice. The next morning, he searched for English podcasts and started listening while eating breakfast. At first, it felt overwhelming. The speakers talked too fast, and he could barely keep up. He only caught a few words here and there, but most of the conversation sounded like a blur. Not discouraged, Jake kept going. He started watching English movies with subtitles, paying close attention to how words were pronounced. He noticed that native speakers connected words together, and some sounds even disappeared in fast speech. It was completely different from the textbook English he had learned in school. He also listened to real conversations, in cafes, on the bus, and even in online videos. At first, it felt frustrating. How will I ever understand this, he thought. But instead of trying to understand everything, he focused on catching key words and phrases. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, things began to change. He started recognizing common expressions and understanding conversations more naturally. He still couldn't understand every single word, but he no longer felt lost. For the first time, Jake felt like he was truly learning English, not by memorizing, but by absorbing it, just like a child learning their first language. The transformation. After weeks of consistent listening, something incredible started happening. Jake began recognizing common phrases and expressions without even trying. He no longer had to translate words in his head. He just knew what they meant. Conversations that once felt like a confusing blur were now making sense. One afternoon, Jake was sitting in a cafe when he overheard two tourists struggling to order food. Without thinking, he stepped forward and said, "Do you need any help?" The words came out naturally, without hesitation. The tourist smiled, relieved. Yes, please. We don't understand the menu very well. Jake quickly explained some of the items, and as he spoke, he noticed something surprising. His words were flowing smoothly. He wasn't pausing to think about grammar or struggling to find the right words. It felt easy, almost effortless. After helping the tourists, Jake sat back down, feeling amazed. How did that just happen? He realized that all those hours of listening had trained his brain in ways he hadn't expected. He had absorbed sentence structures, pronunciation, and rhythm just by listening. It was as if his mind had been silently storing patterns of speech, and now, when he needed to speak, the words just came out naturally. That night, as he reflected on his progress, he smiled. The old man was right. Speaking fluently wasn't just about memorizing, it was about listening first. By hearing real conversations, his brain had picked up the flow of natural English, making it easier to respond without overthinking. For the first time, Jake truly believed he was on the path to fluency, not by forcing himself to speak, but by letting the language sink in through listening. The challenge. After noticing his improvement, Jake felt excited but also nervous. He had been listening for weeks, and his speaking had improved, but he had never tested himself in a real high-pressure situation. So, he decided to challenge himself. He signed up for an English-speaking event at a local community center. It was an open discussion where people from different backgrounds came together to practice English. On the day of the event, Jake walked in and saw a group of people chatting in English. His heart pounded. What if I make mistakes? What if I don't understand them? Doubts started creeping in, but then he remembered something. He had been listening to English every single day. He had already helped tourists without thinking too much. This was just another conversation. Taking a deep breath, he joined a group discussion. At first, he mostly listened, just like he had trained himself to do. The native speakers talked fast, but to his surprise, he understood most of it. When it was his turn to speak, he responded without overthinking. The words came naturally, and he even used some of the phrases he had picked up from podcasts and movies. The group smiled at him. Wow, your English is really good. How long have you been learning? One of them asked. Jake couldn't believe it. People were complimenting his fluency. For the first time, he felt truly proud of his progress. He wasn't just memorizing English anymore. He was living it. Walking home that evening, he smiled to himself. This was just the beginning. He had proven to himself that listening had transformed his speaking, and now there was no stopping him. Conclusion. With a newfound sense of confidence, Jake felt like a completely different person. He no longer feared speaking English. Instead, he enjoyed it. Conversations that once made him nervous now felt exciting. He could understand people easily, respond naturally, and even joke around in English. One day, he decided to return to the park to find the old man who had given him the life-changing advice. As he approached, he saw the man sitting on the same bench, feeding the birds. Jake smiled and said, "You were right. Listening changed everything for me." The old man looked up and grinned. "I knew it would. So tell me, how do you feel now?" Jake sat beside him. Like I unlocked a secret. I used to struggle so much, but once I focused on listening, everything became easier. Now I tell others the same thing. Fluency isn't just about speaking, it's about listening first. The old man nodded. Exactly. The more you listen, the better you speak. Fluency is built with your ears first. Jake left the park that day feeling grateful and inspired. He had learned a valuable lesson. not just for himself, but one he could share with others. He started encouraging his friends and classmates to focus on listening, just as he had. And now we share this lesson with you. If you want to speak English fluently, start by listening. Podcasts, movies, conversations, anything. Let your ears absorb the language, and your speaking will improve naturally. If you found this story helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing English learning stories. Keep listening, keep learning, and keep growing.